Question 23, Philosopher. An action is morally right if it would be reasonably expected to increase the aggregate well-being of the people affected by it. An action is morally wrong if and only if it would be reasonably expected to reduce the aggregate well-being of the people affected by it. Thus, actions that would be reasonably expected to leave unchanged the aggregate well-being of the people affected by them are also right. So first step, argument or facts. Clearly we have an argument, structural indicator of thus. Our conclusion, the last sentence, that actions that would be reasonably expected to leave unchanged the aggregate well-being of the people affected by them are also right. And how do we know that? Well, the philosopher gives us a number of general principles. And we notice sufficient and necessary terminology. In the first sentence, if, and in the second sentence, if and only if. So let's diagram these. The first sentence, we know if introduces a sufficient condition. So our first principle is reasonably expected to increase the aggregate well-being of the people affected by it. So reasonably expected to increase the aggregate well-being of the people affected by it, then we know the action is morally right. Contrapositive, if it's not morally right, then it is not reasonably expected to increase the aggregate well-being of the people affected by it. The next sentence, an action is morally wrong if and only if it would be reasonably expected to reduce the aggregate well-being of the people affected by it. So again, we know if and only if is sufficient and necessary. So morally wrong would be sufficient for reasonably expected to reduce the aggregate well-being of the people affected by it. But it is also necessary, which would make reasonably expected to reduce the aggregate well-being sufficient. Contrapositives here, if it is not expected to reduce the aggregate well-being, then it is not morally wrong. Then, if it is not morally wrong, it is not expected to reduce the aggregate well-being of the people affected by it. And from that, the author concludes, therefore, or thus in this case, actions that would be reasonably expected to leave unchanged the aggregate well-being of the people affected by them are also right. So, reasonably expected to keep the aggregate well-being unchanged or constant, they are also morally right. Does that conclusion follow? Well, if you notice, we only have morally right in our first principle, and the sufficient condition there was that it was reasonably expected to increase the aggregate well-being of the people affected by it. In our conclusion, our sufficient condition is reasonably expected to keep the aggregate well-being constant, unchanged, which is not the same thing as increasing it. So that's not working. So let's think, if it's reasonably expected to keep the aggregate well-being unchanged, wouldn't that mean that it is not reducing the aggregate well-being? Keeping it unchanged is the same thing as saying you're not reducing it. However, that is sufficient for not morally wrong. Our conclusion here was morally right. So you notice that this argument makes a jump from not morally wrong to morally right. So this is a flawed argument. There is a missing assumption here. And again, since we know reasonably expected to leave the aggregate well-being unchanged is the same thing as reasonably expected not to reduce the aggregate well-being. If it's unchanged, then it's not reducing it. We know from our second principle's contrapositive that that is sufficient for not morally wrong, which would be the correct conclusion here. But the conclusion is morally right. So now that we've clearly identified that this argument is flawed, let's proceed to the question stem. The philosopher's conclusion follows logically if which one of the following is assumed, and you notice follows logically if. So this is a strengthened with sufficient premise question, where again we are trying to 100% guarantee the conclusion that if it's going to leave the aggregate well-being unchanged, then it's morally right. Well, again, we know that if it leaves the aggregate well-being unchanged, that's the same thing as not reducing the aggregate well-being, which tells us that it's not morally wrong. If we want to guarantee that it's morally right, well, therefore, we would say that if you're not morally wrong, you are morally right. So looking for an answer choice that ties not being morally wrong into being morally right. A. Only wrong actions would be reasonably expected to reduce the aggregate well-being of the people affected by them. So again, we know only introduces necessary, so wrong actions, making our sufficient condition reasonably expected to reduce the aggregate well-being. And you notice A adds nothing, because again, assuming wrong actions here is the same thing as morally wrong. You notice that is what we have here from our second principle. So A adds nothing new, so A would be eliminated. How could that strengthen this argument, let alone guarantee it? It's already there. B, no action is both right and wrong, not both. So if you are right, then you are not wrong. And if you are wrong, then you are not right. The problem here is that we know that it's not morally wrong. We can't take the fact that it's not wrong to come backwards and conclude that it's right. That would be incorrect, flawed logic. We know we don't just reverse. So while B does tie the idea of right and wrong together, it doesn't do it properly to guarantee this conclusion, so B would be eliminated. Which brings us to C. Any action that is not morally wrong is morally right. We know any introduces sufficient. So if you are not morally wrong, then you are morally right. And you notice that is exactly what we said we needed to guarantee the conclusion. So C here would be the correct answer, as it 100% guarantees the conclusion. Because again, we know that if you are reasonably expected to leave the aggregate well-being unchanged, that is the same thing as reasonably expected not to reduce the aggregate well-being. And the contrapositive of our second general principle told us that if you are not reasonably expected to reduce the aggregate well-being, then you are not morally wrong. Now, C tells us if you're not morally wrong, then you are morally right, and that is the conclusion of this passage. So C is clearly the correct answer. But again, just making sure, D, there are actions that would be reasonably expected to leave unchanged the aggregate well-being of the people affected by them. Okay, great, but that just tells us that they're not morally wrong. We still need to get to the point that they're morally right. All D is telling us is that there are actions that would be reasonably expected to leave unchanged the aggregate well-being of the people affected by them. So we have our sufficient condition that reasonably expected to not reduce the aggregate well-being, of the people affected by them, which tells us that they're not morally wrong, but again, doesn't get us to morally right. So D doesn't help us. And then E, only right actions have good consequences. Good consequences is completely irrelevant. What does that have to do with this passage? Does not strengthen, definitely does not guarantee, so E would be eliminated.